you sign out, don't end meeting for all.
It looks like the numbers are starting to level off. So I think maybe it'll take me a couple of minutes to do the introduction. So maybe I'll go ahead and get started. Well, I want to welcome everyone to this IBIS seminar series on environmental justice. This is the first of 6 seminars on the topic. The seminar series this fall has been organized by 2 IBIS faculty members, Rachel Wetz and Myles Lennon. And I'm going to tell you just a tiny bit about IBIS, why we selected environmental justice as our theme for the fall, and then introduce today's speaker, who's Myles Lennon. So IBIS was founded in 2014, and it brought 2 former units on campus at Brown together. One was the Center for Environmental Studies, which was founded in 1977, one of the first environmental studies programs in the country. And the center was really focused on 2 issues early on. One of them was environmental education, and the other really was an environmental justice issue, which was lead poisoning in Rhode Island, which was differentially impacting certain populations in the state, and you know, was a huge health problem. And the other unit that predated IBIS was the Environmental Change Initiative, which got founded maybe 10 or 15 years later and had the goal of bringing faculty from across campus working in different disciplines together to work on difficult, intractable environmental problems and find solutions. And in 2014, these 2 units came together and merged those goals, right? So research and education came together. And you know, IBIS is nationally distinctive in a number of ways. There are a lot of environmental institutes at universities. Most of them actually really only exist on paper, unlike IBIS, which is tangible, has faculty appointed in the unit, as a building and buildings where people meet. But really importantly, what IBIS does that's different than almost every other environmental institute is bring parity between the natural and social sciences. Most institutes are really oriented around natural sciences with a few token social scientists, and that is not the case at IBIS. We actually have one of the strongest environmental social science programs in the country, definitely top 5 in environmental sociology, environmental history, recently added anthropologists, which we're really excited about. And you know, we're growing. But the other way that IBIS is really distinctive is that undergraduate education is integrated into our core activities. We're one of the only institutes that actually runs an undergraduate program. And I think what's so cool about having an institute like IBIS at Brown is that the hierarchy at Brown is really flat. And undergraduates, they don't just work for faculty, they collaborate with faculty, they lead research, and that IBIS likes to enable that. And you know, we've got a number of world-class strengths. We're really leading the way on understanding the industrial machinery behind the climate misinformation campaign. We're doing this amazing work, understanding what's happening in the Arctic right now and how that's going to feed back through sea level rise to affect all of us. And we're doing super cool work kind of at the forefront of understanding how climate change is impacting biological diversity on the planet. And one of the areas that we really want to grow into is environmental justice. And, you know, as you know, the foundation for any society is the environment in which it finds itself. And the environment is critical for any society's success. And I would say, you know, what else really does society depend on? Civilization in general is justice. It's the cornerstone of civilization. And I think the intersection of those 2 is really important. And I think Myles will appreciate this, but those things often exist in the background of our thinking. And what we want to do, I think what Myles and others want to do is bring it to the foreground. Make sure it is front and center in the way we're making decisions. And so it's in that context that I'm really happy to introduce Myles. And I've already said a lot, so I'm going to keep this kind of short, but Myles is extraordinary. He grew up in New York City. He came to Brown as an undergrad. did good things here, went off and got a PhD at Yale, and then we were lucky enough to rehire him. We didn't just rehire him, he actually got hired into a very prestigious type of faculty position, an endowed chair position, which are rare. I'd like one, but anyway, they're really cool. And Myles has one, and he's jointly appointed between IBIS, which is the Institute of Brown for Environment and Society, and the Anthropology Department. And I'm going to turn it over now to Myles. So thank you, Myles.
Great, thank you, Dove. It's so great to see so many new and old faces. It's beaming at me in my house. I'm just going to jump right in, and I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Okay. So, as Dove mentioned, I'm Myles Lennon. I'm an environmental anthropologist, and I'm currently in the occupied ancestral lands of the Narragansett people, a place known to most of us as Providence, Rhode Island. Now, this acknowledgement of the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett people is more than just the perfunctory recognition of the ravages of settler colonialism that we've come to expect in many academic talks. Instead, I'm beginning today's talk on environmental justice by acknowledging the settler colonialism that I'm implicated in, because my present day occupation of the Narragansett's ancestral land is an immediate reminder that the settler colonial exploitation and extraction of North American ecosystems, indigenous peoples, non-human species, trees, rocks, tributaries, and coasts were environmental injustices out of which our cities, states, universities, and institutions emerged. Which is to say, environmental injustice is not simply an important social problem for us to address through research or activism. Instead, environmental injustice, quite literally, is foundational to the totality of life as we know it in a settler colony like Rhode Island. And environmental injustice constitutes the social and geopolitical realities that we take to be normal in the contemporary United States, more broadly speaking. So by extension, working toward environmental justice, or EJ for short, is not simply about proving inequalities in access to clean water or fighting for legislation to protect communities of color from climate change, although it certainly is these things. Working toward environmental justice on a more fundamental level is about making connections between, for instance, the extractive forms of land management in the so-called Providence plantations that decimated indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans on the one hand, and the extractive forms of energy management set to locate an LNG power plant in the predominantly Latinx and Black South Side of Providence today, on the other hand. EJ is about confronting the fact that the exploitation and decimation of the land, non-human life, and the biosphere have never and will never occur without the exploitation and decimation of racially, economically, and geographically marginalized human beings and communities. These things go hand in hand, something that EJ, as both a movement and a scholarly practice, has been telling us for a very long time. So it's in this spirit of making connections that I want to suggest that now is a particularly ripe time to explore EJ, faced as we are with three intersecting crises: climate, COVID, and systemic racism. For all three are largely centered on harrowing realities crystallized in the final words of George Floyd and before him Eric Gardner, namely, "I can't breathe." I can't breathe. Indeed, as Black and Latinx communities are disproportionately ravaged by COVID, which strains the upper respiratory system while constraining airways and lungs, disproportionately exposed to fossil fuel production, petrochemical plants, and dirty infrastructure that cause asthma and other respiratory problems, and systematically ravaged by a force of police brutality that often takes a form of asphyxiation in both non-lethal and lethal ways, I can't breathe can be a more apt summation of the material impacts of white supremacy on a pandemic-stricken nation looking its racist demons in the eye. Meanwhile, the West Coast burns, exacerbating that breathlessness in a telling sign of climate collapse. Furthermore, it is precisely these communities' proximity to climate-changing fossil fuels and the disinvestment in their built environment through which we fund militarized police forces that created the so-called pre-existing conditions that have made us more vulnerable to COVID. Vulnerability, which again is further exacerbated by the ugly products of climate change and also settler colonial land management as evinced by those West Coast fires. In other words, the environment sits at the ugly intersections of the many racially and economically inequitable crises engulfing this country. What we are witnessing then in this moment of intersecting crises is environmental injustice in its most legible form. So now more than ever, it's time for us as a community to take a deep dive into EJ. And I'm gonna attempt to get us started, although this is a much broader conversation, introducing EJ as a grassroots movement and an approach to engage research by focusing specifically on the theme of connections. I'm then going to expand on these connections by drawing from my research on energy transitions to propose a praxis for connecting communities of color in the global north and communities of color in the global south along the supply chains of solar energy technology. So in the US, environmental justice is often defined according to its EPA definition, which is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws. Environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So while this definition captures some of the spirit of EJ, it's nonetheless an extraordinarily incomplete definition. First of all, it focuses narrowly on laws, not on movement building, not on engaged research, and not on representation in its myriad forms as opposed to simply in the legislative sphere. This definition privileges equality over equity, which is to say it's not focused on proactively redressing historical structural injustices, but on ensuring that everyone is treated the same. And equality and equity are not, in fact, identical. But most problematically, this definition does not speak to the ways in which EJ is continually focused on forging new connections across time and space. For EJ is first and foremost a global movement led by economically and racially marginalized community leaders that recognize that their local struggles are all connected. A movement whose name originated in the US and in US communities of color in particular in the latter part of the 20th century, but a name that nonetheless draws connections between a range of different struggles that themselves connect the sphere of life that we know colloquially as the environment with all forms of institutionalized inequality. More specifically, I want to stress that the EJ movement emerged not out of a single foundational struggle, but rather through connections forged between many, many, many different struggles and many movements. As Cole and Foster point out, EJ, as we've come to know it, grew out of 5 robust activist traditions: the civil rights movement, the anti-toxics movements of the 1960s and 1970s, indigenous anti-colonial struggles, the labor movement, and the traditional environmental movement, of course, in addition to really pioneering public health and epidemiological research in the 1970s and 1980s. And to the schema, I would also add to that list the reproductive health movement. So when, for instance, Martin Luther King in 1968 supported a strike of sanitation workers in Memphis, Southern Black men in the first years after Jim Crow, whose lives were undervalued and degraded in the service of an environmentally destructive local industry. We can call this struggle an environmental justice struggle, even though the term EJ wasn't around then. When Mexican and Filipino migrant activists protested migrant workers' exposure to lethal toxins in the grape picking fields of California as part of the Delano grape strike from 1965 to 1970, a fight which led to the banning of DDT, I should add. We can call this struggle an environmental justice struggle, even though the term EJ wasn't around then. And going way back, when the Narragansett and the Nipmuc and the Pecumtic tribes band together here in present-day Rhode Island and throughout New England to fight the white supremacist occupation and destruction of their forests, tributaries, soil, and bodies that is their environment. in King Philip's War, which was in the 1670s, we can call this struggle even an environmental justice struggle, even though the term EJ certainly wasn't around then. But when we more conventionally talk about the origins of the contemporary EJ movement, we often talk about the mobilization among Black middle-class suburban homeowners. I want to repeat that, Black middle-class suburban homeowners, specifically in Houston, Texas in 1978 and 79, a mobilization against a proposal to build a garbage dump in the middle of their community. And I highlight the fact that they were middle class because even though poor and working class people of all racial and ethnic backgrounds are unequivocally targeted for what in shorthand is called environmental bads, including waste transfer stations and power plants and dumps and petrochemical plants and unhealthy food and highways, even though income and wealth have everything to do with whether you are unfairly harmed by environmental bads or not, race is also extremely significant, such that even when you control for income and wealth, you still find that people of color are disproportionately burdened due largely to spatial segregation and institutional racism. So anyway, these Black homeowners in 1979 organized to form Northeast Community Action Group, which really brought what is considered to be the very first environmental justice class action lawsuit against a corporation, Southwestern Waste Management. And in doing so, they called attention to the fact that they, as a community, were intentionally targeted to house the environmental burdens of Houston's waste due to their race. This lawsuit was also significant because the community worked closely with a young Black sociologist named Robert Bullard to make their case. And Bullard, who has been dubbed the father of environmental justice, Bullard conducted a study that proved that Black neighborhoods in Houston were being intentionally targeted for toxic waste. And this connection between Bullard and the community was really significant because it established a precedent for EJ action, namely on the ground agitation and activism working hand in hand with experts who follow the lead and work in support of the community. We can therefore detect here yet another connection of the EJ movement. Again, that is the connection between activists in marginalized communities and credentialed researchers and experts. So this case was also really significant because it established the courts and judicial system as a central site of EJ action. In other words, in the early days of the EJ movement, class action lawsuits and other forms of litigation were the main institutional channels through which activists and researchers work together to bring about change. So ultimately, though, this case was dismissed, technically on the grounds that the plaintiffs presented insufficient data to demonstrate discrimination. But importantly, very importantly, the judge in this case referred to the plaintiffs in the courtroom as niggers. This is in the Houston courts in 1979. Further evidence that environmental injustice worked not only through class discrimination, but also institutionalized white supremacy. Another defining moment in the environmental justice movement occurred a few years later when in 1982, the state of North Carolina disposed illegally dumped PCBs in a landfill in the primarily Black communities of Warren County, contaminating their water supply. So in response, thousands of people mobilized, occupying the roads, putting their vulnerable bodies on the line. Over 500 protesters were arrested. And although the state continued to dump on the community in spite of this action, it brought national attention to environmental injustices. And one of the local leaders of this action, the civil rights leader, Dr. Benjamin Chavis, coined the term environmental racism in response. And in the process, that's really created a conceptual foundation for further action and further research. So throughout the 1980s and 90s, marginalized communities, and especially those of color, mobilized to protest and litigate against petrochemical plants, sewage treatment plants, landfills, and other discriminately cited toxic facilities. And increasingly, they worked with an emerging cohort of engaged research scientists who compiled and analyzed data on ambient air standards and industrial policies and garbage pickup and waste disposal and incineration and power plant sightings and the paths of freeways and highways. And in the process, they highlighted troves of data that demonstrated how various markers of health and well-being, from asthma rates to childhood morbidity rates to obesity to lead poisoning, were connected with housing discrimination, redlining, segregation, and spatialized inequalities in terms of municipal services, infrastructure, and even things like supermarkets and food services. So in the process, they demonstrated that the environmental quality of any given community in the US largely correlated to race and class demographics, and more specifically to white supremacists and anti-poor policies and governance. And again, the key here was drawing connections among different legal, epidemiological, demographic, and political data sets, and more crucially, between such data sets and activists on the ground mobilizing for EJ. So in October 1991, the EJ movement's pioneering activists and researchers convened to solidify and create new connections among themselves and their various local organizing efforts at the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in Washington, D.C., which included over 300 representatives of the movement from not only the mainland United States, but also Puerto Rico, Canada, Central and South America, and the Marshall Islands. Now, many of the summit delegates had not only similar experiences with environmental racism, but also similar experiences being marginalized and excluded from the mainstream environmental movement. And this had, in various ways, suggested that EJ was, the movement had traditionally suggested that EJ was a separate and less urgent issue than environmental protection, for instance, or conservation. Many of the environmental movement's large, predominantly white NGOs had said in both word and deed that the racist siting of toxic dumps in urban communities, as bad as it was, wasn't connected to deforestation or endangered species or acid rain or national parks or global warming, overlooking how the economies of extraction and waste production that had decimated non-human ecosystems the world over had also designated poor communities and communities of color as dumping grounds and toxic sacrifice zones. How soil, flora, fauna, our atmosphere, and poor brown people have similarly operated as exploitable objects in the interest of an industrialized white supremacist order. So at the summit, EJ leaders confronted this failure on the part of the environmental movement. And they really began to draw connections, putting together a document called the 17 Principles of Environmental Justice, which defined EJ not only in terms of righting the wrongs of environmental injustices, but also affirming an ecological vision centered on respect and love for the non-human world, tying together bodily and reproductive health, human rights, indigenous land occupation, labor safety, and of course, environmental matters. So under the auspices of this document, and also more broadly the summit, the EJ movement committed itself to broader connections, focusing not only on the disproportionate effects of toxic facilities and air pollution, but also a range of other things like public health, labor rights, housing rights, public transportation, and food justice. So emerging from the summit, the EJ movement set its sights on not only fighting injustices in local circumstances, but much broader work, large-scale policy changes that mobilize their networks of expertise to create laws aligned with on-the-ground community needs. Most notably, or most famously, President Clinton's 1994 Executive Order 12898, which directed federal agencies to adopt and implement agency-specific EJ strategies. EJ activists have successfully pushed for their movement demands in also recent climate policies, such as the New York Climate Leadership and Protection Act, the most ambitious statewide climate legislation in the United States. And this legislation requires that at least 35 to 40% of its investments benefits, quote, communities that bear burdens of negative public health effects, environmental pollution, impacts of climate change, and possess certain socioeconomic criteria or comprise high concentrations of low and moderate income households. This is language in the legislation. And this scaling up of the EJ movement also focused on reconceptualizing the environment, moving beyond narrow Cartesian understandings of the environment as some pure non-human wilderness, separate from where humans work, play, and live, reimagining the environment instead as a broad terrain, intimately inclusive of humans and the spaces we call home. So as the EJ movement grew, so too did its theory of justice, which is to say that EJ leaders connected distributive justice, that is the equitable distribution of environmental goods and bads, with recognition justice, that is the concept that justice emerges from an institutional or structural recognition of systemic injustices and of marginalized people's identities and lived experiences, and also participatory justice, that is the concept that justice can't be done unless the party of grievance can meaningfully participate in matters of governance that directly affect their lives and livelihoods. So by connecting these different understandings of justice, EJ moved past a narrow conception of state-sanctioned equality, foregrounding the views, voices, and experiences of people of color in governance and also in our civic discourse more broadly. Finally, EJ as an organizing concept expanded beyond the borders of the US over the last couple of decades, as many grassroots activists in the global South adopted the name and framework of EJ to conceptualize the work that they too have long been doing to fight the extraction and destruction of their communities by industrialized powers. The point here not being that Americans created environmental justice, but rather EJ is a framework that has gone global to conceptualize a range of struggles. So this geographic expansion of EJ as a framework for action has in turn strengthened the connections between communities of color in the global North and communities of color in the global South. Today, though, as we face the intersecting challenges of climate change, COVID, economic collapse, and a national reckoning with racial injustice, the time is ripe for new EJ connections, new efforts to work for the well-being of our planet and our people by challenging the white supremacist, elitist forms of extraction and exploitation that link marginalized communities with the earth we all depend on. So COVID has made crystal clear, I'd say, the intense degree to which our lives are interconnected. And when we recall that the era of epidemics and pandemics has largely been caused by our extractive environmental practices and our relationships with the environment, by monocultures, by animal domestication, and by dense urban development, we can begin to see COVID as very much an environmental injustice by virtue of the fact that it has, as we know, disproportionately impacted poor brown and Black communities the world over. So now then is a time for the EJ movement to continue to work for new connections, strengthening solidarities between marginalized communities in both the global North and the global South. And you know, because across all these communities, we have seen that they have been hurting similarly in both the richest countries like the US and poorest countries. So one starting point for these sorts of new South-North connections is the EJ movement's efforts for what is often called a just transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. That is an energy transition that centers justice and is led by communities of color who have been disproportionately burdened by fossil fuels. So in many regards, this transition work has continued the EJ legacy of drawing out connections, but at the same time, it has also neglected the important North-South connections that I think are particularly crucial in the COVID era. So drawing from a little bit of my ethnographic research on energy transitions in EJ communities in the US, I'm going to now discuss some of the promising connections and more crucially, some of the misconnections of energy transition work. And I'll then propose a praxis for expanding the EJ movement's renewable energy work through new transnational connections that I like to call supply chain solidarity, work that I suggest this particular moment of environmental injustice really demands. So let's first unpack the lively connections that EJ activists have been making in adopting the just transition ethos. Over the last 2 decades, the EJ movement has very consciously moved away from strategies centered on litigation and regulation exclusively, And the movement has increasingly embraced strategies focused on what we often in shorthand call solutions. That is, pragmatic interventions with the potential to be powerful alternatives to the status quo. So to put it really simply and very, 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 very crudely, EJ is focused less these days on identifying problems and more on identifying solutions. Again, this is a crude distillation, but hopefully you get my point. And specifically, these solutions often take the form of community-owned renewable energy. Instead of driving agendas centered only on making polluters pay or on penalizing polluters, the EJ movement has launched a series of really inspiring campaigns intended to build on an alternative world to the fossil-fueled industrial paradigm that has positioned communities of color as sacrifice zones. So, and the movement is always skeptical of large-scale environmentalism divorced from community context. So it has called for energy transitions that are actively focused on and led by communities of color. Communities disproportionately burdened by fossil fuel infrastructure and also disproportionately vulnerable to climate change caused by that fossil fuel infrastructure. So this has often taken the form of community-based solar campaigns focused on ramping up solar installations in communities of color in ways that really enable these communities to own and actively control the power that they depend on to live. And these communities have several barriers to going solar, but really not limited to a lack of funds to pay the expensive upfront cost of solar. Solar is very expensive. Their roofs are often in poor condition. There's a lack of capital improvement funds if they live in buildings to remove or tend to roof infrastructure that could obstruct a solar array. And just more generally, many people in low-income communities of color rent and they don't own their homes. So to address some of these barriers, not all, but some of these barriers, community-based solar campaigns led by local EJ organizations follow what is called the Solarize model for solar development. And through a Solarize campaign, a local organization engages in on-the-ground door knocking and community canvassing to form community-based purchasing pools. These purchasing pools consist of numerous local residents and businesses and community institutions such as houses of worship and even local schools. And all of them, as a purchasing pool, they commit to installing solar with a single contractor who in turn commits to dramatically lowering costs for the community for a set period of time. And as part of this process, the community issues a request for proposals from contractors soliciting pragmatic strategies to make solar very affordable by leveraging economies of scale. So the bigger the community purchasing pool, the more people you have in your purchasing pool, the more concessions that contractors are generally willing to make. And through these concessions, low-income communities have been able to afford solar installations, either taking direct ownership over the infrastructures on their own roofs and their own community centers, or entering into power purchase agreements where they pay no upfront money whatsoever for solar and are entitled to outright ownership of their solar arrays after a set period of third-party ownership. So in facilitating Solarize campaigns, EJ organizations work to proactively address the environmental injustices of polluting fossil fuel facilities in their communities. Working also to try to generate new community wealth by pushing for local jobs in solar installation, and also trying to address the disproportionate burden of energy bills that their communities face, meaning that community solar campaigns strive to reduce energy bills that suck up a far greater percentage of disposable income in many communities of color when you compare them to white communities. Bills that, in some cases, severely limit people from taking care of their many other crucial needs like food and medicine. So in so many ways, Solarize campaigns in communities of color are the epitome of environmental justice, connecting a grassroots movement that made a name by opposing toxic industry with the proactive solutions of renewable energy. Furthermore, EJ organizations often situate this just transition work in a broader framework for change, such as this very often cited and reproduced graphic that contrasts the profit-oriented violence of what's often called the extractive economy with the sustainable communalism that it calls the regenerative economy. Yet, for all the notable connections of EJ Solarized campaigns, and they really are great, I want to suggest that this extractive regenerative dichotomy, the sense that community solar campaigns are fighting the status quo, that this image overlooks the numerous environmental injustices that are part and parcel of solar supply chains. In other words, when we look beneath the shiny gloss of a solar array, we find that it actually betrays this extractive regenerative dichotomy because it's precisely the extractive economy, mining, dumping, corporate commodities, transnational supply chains, poor labor conditions in communities of color. It's precisely these things that make many, not all, but many solar panels possible. Let me repeat that because it's an important point. It's precisely the extractive economy, again, the mining, the dumping, the corporations, the transnational supply chains, the poor labor conditions, the exploited communities of color. It's all these things that make solar panels possible, many solar panels possible, not all, many. So solar, because solar is often made with toxic chemicals like silicon tetrachloride and cadmium, plastics, which of course are made from fossil fuels, deplorable labor conditions, primarily in China, where many indigent workers' communities are poisoned by the pollution from solar manufacturing plants and silicon tetrachloride in particular, or here in the United States, where federal prisoners manufacture panels for essentially no wages. And hell, for that matter, while we tout the carbon emissions reducing capacity of renewable energy, sulfur hexafluoride, the most potent greenhouse gas, 25,000 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide, has been used to clean the reactors in solar manufacturing plants. Although thankfully there's some evidence that suggests that this practice is a thing of the past, although all the evidence I have of that is anecdotal, so knock on wood. Anyway, so solar panels also generate e-waste when they're decommissioned. And e-waste, as we all know, disproportionately burdens global South communities and other poor communities of color. The point here is that as solar panels are deployed in communities of color in the global North to fight environmental injustices, if you follow the supply chain, you find that they're actually contributing to environmental injustices. And also because solarized campaigns are really focused on reducing the cost of solar, on getting a good price. These campaigns don't take into consideration the labor conditions, environmental conditions, the supply chains, corporate social responsibility of the corporations that they're procuring from. So whether a solar manufacturer participates in a recycling take-back program or abides by basic labor standards, or gives the slightest damn about environmental justice is not of relevance when a campaign is focused primarily on getting the best price. So in a solarized campaign, product evaluation often rests on a spreadsheet populated with various metrics related largely to costs, a set of figures entirely divorced from the environmental conditions and more crucially, the justice implications of the products they point to. And while this concern for price is obviously animated by a desire to reduce carbon emissions and our electricity infrastructure, emissions from our electricity infrastructure, I want to suggest that a narrow focus on the quantitative metrics of carbon and cost demonstrates how solar can take our attention away from the means of production by centering what I like to call the means of reduction. And the means of production, of course, refers to raw materials or factories or financial investments or infrastructure, machinery, any other tool used to produce goods, services, and ultimately economic value. What I'm calling the means of reduction refers to the representational practices through which we apprehend a good or service as capable of quantitatively reducing a negative phenomenon, such as anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions or high electricity bills. An example of such a representational practice would be a spreadsheet, something as simple as a spreadsheet, or even a cost reduction graphic like this, like the one on your screen. So in focusing on the means of reduction instead of the means of production, EJ groups unwittingly reproduce the logics and practices of the extractive economy in spite of their best efforts to realize a regenerative economy. So specifically, in focusing on reducing prices, they prioritize contractors who use solar panels manufactured by companies with a poor record of worker rights, health and safety, a poor record of reporting on their supply chains and on their panels' toxicity, and a mediocre record of using energy and generating greenhouse gas emissions in their operations. And this is all according to data from the Silicon Valley Toxic Coalition. So to address this and to better align community-based solar campaigns with environmental justice, I want to suggest that the EJ movement must build on their tradition of drawing connections and really connect their efforts for EJ in their homes with efforts for EJ along the entire supply chain that they're implicated in. So toward this end, I want to propose a new community solar praxis committed to EJ at all points of the solar supply chain, and not just at spaces of consumption, which is typically how we think about a solarized campaign. So the praxis consists of a conceptual framework or a theory focused on co-pollutants and 3 pragmatic practices for operationalizing this framework. So I'm now going to break down this, starting with the co-pollutant framework, a framework focused on recognition. For if we want to deploy solar in low-income communities of color to secure environmental justice, the very, very first step, as basic as it is, we must first simply recognize that all forms of industrialized energy, including solar, have corrosive repercussions that disproportionately affect communities of color. And one way we can recognize such harms is through the EJ concept of co-pollutants. So this concept calls attention to the ways in which energy generation and other industrial practices simultaneously generate greenhouse gases on the one hand, and pollutants such as nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter. So in labeling such pollutants co-pollutants, EJ scholars highlight how the fossil fueled infrastructures that significantly contribute to climate change also contribute to public health problems that disproportionately impact communities of color and poor communities of color. But crucially, analyses of co-pollutants highlight the ways in which some strategies to reduce greenhouse gases only marginally reduce environmental hazards in marginalized communities, and inversely, the ways in which other strategies simultaneously significantly address environmental injustices, because there's not an identical correlation between greenhouse gas emissions and co-pollutants across different industrial sectors, meaning that some efforts to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions more effectively mitigate co-pollutants than others. As such, an EJ approach to climate mitigation explicitly prioritizes strategies that optimally addresses co-pollutants. So we can apply this EJ approach to renewable energy infrastructures and solarized campaigns in particular. Just as consumption of fossil fuels generates nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, and particulate matter, the production of solar utilizes silicon tetrachloride and hydrofluoric acid and cadmium and other toxins that also disproportionately harm poor communities of color. So we can conceptualize these hazards as the co-pollutants of the very minimal, still very minimal greenhouse gas emissions generated by solar production. So with this in mind, with this theory, this framework in mind, EJ solar campaigns, I think, can move beyond the narrow focus on reducing electricity bills and their attendant greenhouse gas emissions by addressing environmental injustices through strategies that reduce co-pollutants across solar supply chains, which is to say that a shift to co-pollutants calls on us to not merely reduce a single metric of harm, but rather to attenuate multiple metrics of harm across communities of color at every point of solar supply chains. So with this sort of broad framework and now in mind, we can then pragmatically incorporate this co-pollutant idea into solarized campaigns by transforming how we leverage economies of scale. And this could entail 3 things. First, on the most basic level, this entails shifting the campaign focus from consumer power to people power. Second, this entails broadening solarized purchasing pools in ways that reflect the shift. And finally, this entails working towards supply chain solidarity between communities of color that produce solar infrastructure and communities of color that consume such infrastructure. So I'll now lay out these 3 interventions. So first, let's start with shifting the focus from consumer power to people power, which admittedly, this is the most basic of the 3 interventions, but still I think really important, really foundational. So as we've discussed, the formation of large purchasing pools is a fairly pragmatic way of overcoming marginalized communities' financial barriers to solar. But this rationale, as we've discussed, solidifies a consumer market logic that suggests that social transformation and material well-being are best secured through quantifiable interventions grounded in the alleged rationalities of the market, and therefore divorced from the alleged irrational social structures like white supremacy and colonialism. The co-pollutant framework really troubles this latent logic by exposing the ways in which a premium on consumer price reductions in poor communities of color in the global north can contribute to the generation of toxins in poor communities of color in the global south, fomenting the longstanding environmental injustices which we've talked about. So with this in mind, the first step to incorporating a co-pollutants framework into a Solarize campaign is to simply acknowledge that any effort to achieve economies of scale in the energy sector necessarily reproduces extractive and exploitative systems as evinced by, again, the distribution of co-pollutants. And this acknowledgement can take the form of a Solarize campaign mission statement, a formal declaration at the beginning of campaign meetings, or a written theory of change that campaign organizers develop and subscribe to, or really all of the above. And with this acknowledgement in place, campaign organizers can begin to shift their campaign's economies of scale approach from one that is focused on consumer power to one that's focused on people power. And instead of focusing on generating a broad pool of consumers who leverage their purchasing power toward cost reductions, campaigns could focus on generating a critical mass of people who leverage their collective power to create a regenerative economy that works to limit co-pollutants in all communities, including obviously those in the crosshairs of industrial production in China. So such a shift in focus could also take shape through a campaign mission statement, or the articulation of goals at the beginning of campaign meetings, or a written theory of change, or all the above. So this is the sort of rudimentary work, and that I still think is really foundational and important. And with this sort of formal articulation in place, we can actually pursue strategies to address co-pollutants in Solarize campaigns, which brings me to my second intervention, broadening Solarize purchasing pools. So once Solarize campaigns commit to shifting from a narrow vision of consumer power to a broader vision of people power, they can operationalize this commitment by expanding their purchasing pools from the local level to the citywide or regional level, focusing their efforts on mass movement building. And basically this would entail rejecting a narrow organizing ethos focused on targeting individual consumers in a particular geographic market, and instead generating a broad-based organizing effort centered on communities of color working in solidarity with one another. Expansive regional purchasing pools committed to EJ could begin to work toward this end by better leveraging the power of marginalized communities to minimize co-pollutants by specifically demanding concessions of industry that go well beyond simple price reductions. So specifically, community groups, house of worship, and other local institutions in contiguous communities of color across local borders can begin to cooperate on larger Solarize campaigns that pledge to target wider swaths of homes and buildings for solar installations at fixed tier pricing. And these partnerships could then collaboratively issue a giant request for proposals for accredited contractors to install multiple megawatts. So not 10 or 12 kilowatts or 100 kilowatts, or even 500 kilowatts, talking multiple megawatts of residential solar across multiple properties regionally. And a campaign that pledges to reach that sort of scale through tiered pricing proposals in the residential sector would represent a level of consumer demand far greater than what most residential installers are accustomed to for single solar installation initiatives and projects. As such, the sheer scale has the potential to give EJ activists a level of leverage in incentivizing or even demanding environmental justice benefits and supply chain transparency from contractors, including certain high quality labor credentials, supply chain monitoring, high-end procurement, and codified commitments to anti-racist business practices, which collaboratively could minimize co-pollutants. So at the most rudimentary level, This could entail including really basic contractor prerequisites in a citywide or regional solarized RFP. Such an RFP could, for instance, require that all contractors who submit a proposal source their products from companies that adhere to the Solar Energy Industry Association's Solar Industry Environmental and Social Responsibility commitment. That's a product that they have. Or similar standards that are not necessarily particular to the solar industry, like SGS's internationally recognized verifications and certifications, which are flawed, but again, this is a baseline. And contractors who adhere to these really basic sourcing standards and submit a proposal could then be screened according to a point system that rewards contractors that ethically and vigilantly monitor their procurement and supply chain practices. So currently, solarized RFPs evaluate contractors' proposed pricing, system design, quality of equipment, and products, implementation plan, and a commitment to workforce training or hiring. And quality of equipment and products is really key here. And in the context of a solarized campaign, it usually focuses very narrowly on solar panel efficiency, panel warranty, inverter warranty, and workmanship warranty. An expanded solarized campaign with more leverage could introduce other markers of product quality to minimize co-pollutants, such as the use of recycled materials or of minimal toxic heavy metals or less noxious alternatives like zinc sulfide, or the documenting of labor, environmental, and human rights screenings of solar supply chains. And in addition to quality of products, other standards could also be put in place following the Silicon Valley Toxic Coalition's really landmark solar scorecard, whereby contractors could get points in the solarized evaluation process for sourcing from companies that abstain from sourcing products from conflict minerals, or for participating in a recycling or take-back program, for instance. Now, these rather basic innovations to the solarized RFP process cannot definitively adjudicate claims of quality and compliance or raise the industry standards of transparency. Instead, they really represent a starting point for a much more robust process of leveraging economies of scale to minimize co-pollutants in EJ communities' solar and solarized campaigns. The next step and the final step to incorporating a co-pollutants framework into a solarized campaign is to make common cause with communities and workers of color burdened by co-pollutants on the back end of solar supply chains. And this could entail both reviewing reports and research on the workplace hazards of solar manufacturing, and more crucially, forming alliances with activists and workers in the various industries that actually manufacture solar infrastructure to better identify their burdens and demands, demands of their employers. So for instance, Black and Latinx EJ activists in the global north can reach out to transnational organizations like China Labor Watch and China Labor Bulletin, which support worker activists in China's sprawling manufacturing sector, which includes but is not limited to solar and other electronics, to understand the unique harms that workers on the ground are facing, and to identify improvements that could minimize co-pollutants and thereby improve worker and community safety on the back end of solar supply chains. And connecting with such organizations could also enable EJ activists to foster alliances with on-the-ground workers and really deepen their visions for an anti-racist regenerative economy. Activists could then draw from such alliances and information collection to try to develop new standards for reducing co-pollutants through the expanded solarized purchasing pools that I just sort of loosely proposed and mapped out. So this proposed praxis for transforming local solar campaigns is grounded in the broader EJ tradition of making connections, of recognizing that communities of color are subjugated by environmental degradation in incomparable ways across spaces, of addressing the linkages between environmental injustice in the global north and environmental injustice in the global south. As we consider how this very, very particular moment of COVID and racial unrest have exposed both anti-Chinese racism and anti-Black racism, as we consider how the pandemic has directly taken the lives of communities who were already struggling to breathe, and as we try to imagine a sustainable economy to lift up those marginalized communities who have been made all the more vulnerable by the COVID era economic shutdown. It's incumbent on us to continue to innovate EJ, that is, to continue to make new connections, to continue to challenge the received paradigms of environmental action. And my very modest hope is that the supply chain solidarities that I proposed with the community solar praxis I laid out can really begin to work toward these more transformational interconnections, building on the work that communities of color have always engaged in to challenge the destruction of their environments, going all the way back to colonial conquest on the Narragansett lands that I and many of us presently occupy. Thank you very much. So that went way longer than I had hoped. Thank you for bearing with me. You were all saints, really patient, we can open it up to some questions. But the beauty is this is the beginning of a much broader EJ conversation in IBIS at Brown, and hopefully in connection with people not at Brown as well. And so, you know, whatever questions or dialogue we can't get to today, this is just the beginning. And we hope you come back to the rest of our speaker series and that we're engaging even beyond the speaker series. So, so with that, I will just open it up. And I don't know how we are facilitating this. So I'm deferring to our facilitators.
I've asked people to please raise their hands if they have a question so we can see it pop up and give you access. Okay, here's one from Dan. Go ahead, Dan.
Hi, Myles. How's it going?
Good.
So you focused on the solar praxis, and I guess another challenge is transportation and energy storage. Particularly, I'm sort of thinking about lithium batteries in the future as we move to more electric. So how much of what you showed us with the solar sector can be translated to the transportation sector? And I guess I'm thinking about lithium with respect to the extractive nature, you know, the need to triple the supply of world's lithium in the next decade. And the supply chain solidarity really seems like it has a lot of parallels there. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Dan. It's a really important question. Generally speaking, the framework that I laid out is absolutely applicable and perhaps even more urgent with regard to lithium extraction and all that extraction is, as you point out, imperative if we want to build a robust storage infrastructure. The challenge is that unlike many of the toxic materials that are put in some of the worst forms of solar panels that we procure, there aren't a lot of great alternatives. And our storage system is unfortunately quite toxic. So, I mean, really the applicability of the framework that I laid out to thinking about storage, I think, is that any activist, any EJ activist in the global north, or any EJ activist period who's interested in a just transition to renewable energy does need to be making common cause, I think, along the supply chains. And that includes the lithium supply chains. And the workers in Congo and Central Africa Republic who are mining lithium in really unorganized ways. They don't even have the kinds of representation of a China Labor Watch, for instance. And so making common cause is all the more fraught and therefore I think all the more necessary. How that actually translates into a more sustainable storage system, I don't have the answers for, unfortunately, but I do think it's really important for us to not be complacent with our energy systems on the consumption side. We always need to be making common cause with people affected along all our supply chains. I wish I had a better answer, but I think that that's all we could do is start there.
Yeah, thanks for that answer.
I'm going to jump in and just raise my real hand. So I think this is a really innovative proposition. Thank you so much for making these connections. I want to make a connection when we think about electrical consumption. It's one component of housing consumption in general. And we know that there's a lot of disparities in the kind of quality of housing that people consume in the United States. And so when I think about the kind of investment that you have to make in a housing unit, particularly a single family home, in order to install solar panels, you know, it worries me, because I think, well, you know, if a roof isn't solid, if the, you know, quality of the electrical infrastructure in the housing unit is in disrepair, if other things aren't working well in the actual physical structure, then I'm not sure if it makes sense, right, to make this sort of investment. And so, in addition to thinking about the connections that with, you know, the production, the commodity chain, I'm thinking about the connections from the consumer point of view. Like, how do you overcome some of the housing quality?
That's a great point. And I'm going to respond directly to that, but I also want to note, Timmons just put in the chat, mentioned Thea Rio-Francos at Providence College, who's dealing with lithium and supply chains in really awesome ways. And that's really spot on. We should really read her book and check out her work. That's a great question about housing. As I mentioned, many low-income communities of color can't get solar because their housing stock is in disrepair. The roof are not in good enough condition, or they don't have the capital improvement funds to deal with things like obstructions that prevent you from putting an array on. But one thing that I didn't talk about in this talk that is actually really the centerpiece of many of these community solar campaigns is a thing called community shared solar, which is an approach to putting giant arrays on community facilities and having through a system called virtual net metering, have community participants who don't necessarily have solar on their own roof to still purchase the electricity generated by those community shared community solar arrays. And really, I would argue in so many ways, both in terms of building solidarity among the community, in working against the sort of privatization of the domestic sphere, and in fostering levels of cooperation that are really necessary to build a regenerative economy. I think focusing on community shared solar is a far better approach than on individualized rooftop solar, to your point. So absolutely. I also want to sort of say that through community shared solar projects where many low-income community members don't have to pay any upfront costs, but then see their energy bills go down because they're purchasing electricity generated by these shared solar arrays, that brings down their housing costs, which can then be invested in improving their own housing. So there are ways of thinking systematically about building feedback loops that enable communities to reinvest in areas that have been disinvested in, such as their housing, through community shared solar. Well, I'll just say there's no reason to force more questions. I don't know. I know many of us are in Providence. It's beautiful. It's 4:34 on a Friday. We've probably all been looking at Zoom a ton for the last 5 days. So I'm happy with adjourning, and I will just put my email in the chat if for whatever reason you don't have it. And if you want to continue the conversation, I hope so. And I hope that, oh, that was to Nina, not to everyone. Everyone, there we go. I hope that you all come to our next talk. We're having Mike Mendez from UC Irvine in a couple weeks. He's really awesome. He's like way more knowledgeable and like of EJ and like how to really get things done than any anthropologist is. No offense to the anthropologists, but you know, we're more conceptual. So I really hope that you can join us same time, same place, 2 weeks from now. And every Friday thereafter, every other Friday thereafter, 3:30 on Zoom. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Myles.
Bye, guys.